They said she'd failed, dragged her kids into a pile of rust and ruin with no future, no plan, and no chance. But what everyone else saw as junk, she saw as a last shot at freedom. A single mom, 2 kids, a loyal dog, and a scrapyard full of forgotten metal. That's how the miracle began. By the time the truth came out, those same people weren't laughing anymore. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories about grit, hope, and jaw-dropping comebacks move, you don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow's episode might just be even wilder than this one. The tires crunched against gravel as the minivan rolled to a stop, the engine clicking in protest. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting a warm glow over a mess of twisted metal, crumpled car doors, and half-buried appliances. To most people, it looked like a scrapyard left behind by time, but to Dana Holt, it was the last place on earth still in her name. She sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel like it might steady the chaos inside her. In the rearview mirror, she caught the wide eyes of her 2 kids. Ava, 7, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, and Max, 5, still sticky from juice boxes and road trip snacks. Their golden retriever, Jasper, whined from the back seat, tail thumping uncertainly against a box of emergency supplies. "This is it," Dana said softly, more to herself than to them. "We made it." The house, if it could still be called that, slouched at the far end of the property, its roof half-patched in tin, porch sagging, windows cloudy with age and dust. Her grandfather had owned this yard, once a bustling auto salvage business decades ago. But he died with more rust than revenue, and the land had sat untouched since. Dana had inherited it after everything else fell apart. The house, the job, the marriage. She didn't come because she wanted to. She came because there was nowhere else left to go. The kids climbed out slowly. Max dragged a small plastic suitcase along the dirt path. Ava held her mother's hand but kept glancing nervously at the piles of scrap towering around them like metal skeletons. Inside, the house was worse than she remembered. Cobwebs laced the corners. The air smelled like old motor oil and mildew. Dana dropped her backpack on the floor and opened a window, only to have the crank fall off in her hand. "Home sweet junk," she muttered. That night, after cleaning the least dusty room and making a nest of blankets for the kids, Dana sat on the back porch steps with Jasper curled at her feet. Her phone had no service. Her bank account had $46 left. The nearest grocery store was 20 miles away, and tomorrow, she'd have to start figuring out how to feed her family. She looked out across the yard, mountains of rusted-out parts and old farm equipment catching the last light of day. Everyone had told her it was worthless, that she'd wasted everything walking away from her ex, from her job, from her easy life. But as she sat in that silence, listening to the wind whistle through steel bones, Dana felt something else. Not despair. A challenge. The morning air was cold, not the kind that bit skin, but the kind that settled deep in the bones. Dana woke on the hard wood floor, one arm around Max, the other still clutched around the only flashlight they had that worked. Ava had curled up near the wall, her feet sticking out from under a quilt with faded sunflowers on it. Jasper snored softly at the door, ears twitching with every creak and whisper outside. She sat up slowly, letting the weight of it all settle on her shoulders. This was real. There was no reset button. The house wasn't going to magically clean itself. No job offer was going to come through the phone. She was here, at the end of everything she used to know and the beginning of whatever came next. In the daylight, the scrapyard looked even bigger. Towers of metal stretched into the tree line, sun glinting off hubcaps and broken windshields. The silence wasn't total. Birds chirped. A breeze rattled through empty car frames, but it felt abandoned. Like something once alive that had been waiting for someone to come back. She poured the last of their bottled water into cups for the kids and gave Jasper a bowlful, making a mental note. Water was now top priority. So was food. So was gas. So was everything. Max sat cross-legged, playing with an old nut and bolt he found in the doorway. Ava wandered through the hallway, her fingers trailing the peeling wallpaper. They weren't crying. Not yet. And Dana was determined to keep it that way. By mid-morning, she was outside with a pair of gloves too big and boots that pinched her heels. She started walking the yard row by row, trying to remember what her grandfather used to say. "Nothing's worthless," he'd grumble. "Just waiting for the right pair of hands." Well, he had her hands now calloused, desperate, and shaking. The first few hours turned up nothing but rust and regret. A few car doors, some busted axles, a refrigerator filled with mouse droppings. But just before lunch, Dana kicked open the warped door to the old office trailer and paused. Dust floated through the air like ghosts. But the place had structure. A workbench, cabinets, and on the desk, a thick black ledger, its edges curled, pages stained with oil. She flipped it open, half expecting it to crumble in her hands. But the writing inside was clear. Numbers, dates, notes scribbled in shorthand. Only someone who knew this place would understand. And tucked inside the back cover a folded blueprint. Old, faded, but unmistakably marked with a red X. Her heart skipped. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, this place wasn't the dead end she thought it was. Dana laid the blueprint across the desk, like it was sacred, and maybe it was. The paper crackled beneath her fingertips as she tried to make sense of the red lines, faded measurements, and the single bold X marked near what appeared to be the back edge of the lot. It looked like a layout of the yard, but distorted, like it had been hand-drawn decades ago. She glanced toward the back window of the trailer. In the distance, the land sloped down toward a pile of rusted farm equipment and crushed vans. That area had always been too overgrown to wander into as a kid. Her grandfather used to call it the pit, said it was where broken things went to be forgotten, and now, maybe remembered. The kids were inside the house still bundled under blankets, exhausted from the long drive and their new reality. She hadn't told them yet that there was no plan, no money, no miracle coming. But now, with the blueprint in hand, something shifted. Maybe she didn't need a miracle. Maybe she needed curiosity, determination, or just enough stubbornness to go looking. She packed a bag with water, gloves, and a flashlight that barely held a charge, then called for Jasper. The dog perked up and followed at her side without hesitation, his tail swishing like he could sense the shift in energy. As they pushed through overgrown weeds and past rust-stained metal, the air grew still, heavy, as though the scrapyard was holding its breath. 15 minutes later, she reached the spot. The exact coordinates marked on the map. A rusted-out school bus slumped against a mound of collapsed fencing, and beneath it, barely visible, was the corner of something metallic and rectangular buried in the ground. She dropped to her knees, heart pounding, and started scraping at the dirt. It took nearly an hour, but eventually, she uncovered a heavy steel hatch bolted shut. No markings, no lock. Just old bolts and decades of silence. Dana sat back, breathing hard. She didn't have the tools to open it yet. But she had something more important, a reason. That night, she studied the ledger. Again, the entries jumped out at her now. Dates matched shipments. Not car parts, but metals, rare ones. Magnesium, aluminum, alloys. Parts tied to Cold War contracts and vintage prototypes. The names listed in the margin didn't mean much to her, but she scribbled them down anyway. Her grandfather hadn't just collected junk. He'd salvaged specific parts, valuable ones. And someone else might know it. The next day, she loaded the kids into the van and drove to the nearest town. It was barely more than a few gas stations, a hardware store, and a diner that looked unchanged since 1965. She pushed open the diner door, her heart in her throat, and walked up to the counter. The waitress looked up and blinked. "Well, I'll be Dana Holt?" It took Dana a second. Then it clicked. "Mrs. Kemper?" The older woman nodded, smiling gently. "I used to serve your granddad coffee every morning, before he headed out to that yard of his. Heard you came back." Dana smiled faintly. "Yeah. I need to ask you something. About him. And maybe someone he used to work with." Mrs. Kemper glanced around and leaned in. "Then you'll want to talk to Martin Greaves. He's the only one left who knew what your granddad was really up to." Dana's grip tightened around her coffee cup. Things were beginning to stir. And the past, it seemed, wasn't done talking. The next morning, Dana left Ava and Max under Mrs. Kemper's watch at the diner with promises of pancakes and coloring books. Jasper stayed with them, tail wagging and tongue hanging out as if he'd been waiting for this kind of warmth since they arrived. Dana, meanwhile, headed across town to find Martin Greaves. The address led her to a faded white trailer behind a rusting chain-link fence. A hand-painted mailbox read, M. Greaves, in uneven brushstrokes. She hesitated before knocking, wondering what kind of man remembered the intricacies of a scrapyard and its secrets decades after it had shut down. The door creaked open before her hand touched it. An older man with sun-leathered skin, thick glasses, and a walking cane eyed her from the shadows. "You're Holt's girl," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Dana replied cautiously. "Dana." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and stepped aside. "Come in, before the ghosts change their minds." Inside, the air was thick with motor oil and pipe smoke. Tools hung from every surface, and framed newspaper clippings lined the walls. Greaves moved slowly, but with purpose, and settled into an armchair that groaned under his weight. He gestured for her to sit across from him. "You found the ledger," he said after a long silence. Dana's pulse quickened. "How did you know?" "I told your granddad to keep one. You don't salvage the kind of material we were dealing with without keeping records. Or secrets." "What kind of material?" Greaves smiled, almost sadly. "Aircraft, grade scrap, military, surplus, off-books deals with engineers out at Lockridge plant." He was smarter than he let on, knew the value wasn't just in what things were, but in what they could become. Dana pulled out the folded blueprint. Greaves' eyes locked on it. "You found the hatch." She nodded. He let out a low whistle. "That's not junk down there. That's everything we couldn't store up top. Kept it off the books, under the radar. Some of those parts? Worth thousands. Maybe more now. Vintage builders, collectors, restoration freaks, they'd kill for half of it." Dana's mind raced. "But why hide it?" "Because not everyone played clean," he said. "There were others. Investors, scavengers. People who wanted what he found. So he buried the best of it. Said if the right person came along, they'd figure it out." Her throat tightened. "He meant me." Greaves nodded. "I think he hoped it'd be you. Or someone like you. Someone who saw beyond rust." That afternoon, Dana returned to the yard, her boots crunching dry dirt as she stared at the hatch again. Her kids were back in the house, unaware that below their feet lay something that could change their lives. She hadn't told them yet. Not because she didn't believe, but because she was scared to hope. Later that evening, Ava wandered into the trailer office as Dana reviewed the ledger again. The little girl held something in her hand. "I found this stuck to the inside of the old truck," she said, offering a thin, rusted tag. Dana turned it over. It had a serial number. And beneath it, stamped faintly in the metal, "Property of U.S. Department of Defense." Dana looked at her daughter. Her voice came out like a whisper. "Sweetheart, we just found a gold mine." Word traveled faster than Dana expected. It started with Mrs. Kemper's knowing nod and a half-whisper at the diner, then reached Martin Greaves who, after one long stare at the blueprint, promised to make a phone call. By the time Dana climbed the porch steps that afternoon, someone was waiting at the edge of the yard. A tall man in a faded suit jacket with a newspaper tucked under his arm, and a face that looked like it had seen too many deals go sideways. He introduced himself as Ellis March, which meant nothing to Dana at first. But when he touched the ledger gently, reverently, the way someone might touch an old Bible, she realized he knew the language of paper and ink, just as much as paint and rust. His eyes were the kind that sized a person up, and then decided whether they were worth the trouble. "You Dana Holt?" he asked, voice low, practiced. "Yes," she said. Her kids peeked from behind the doorway, wary but curious. Ellis walked the yard like someone retracing memories, stepping around loose transmissions and hunks of metal without needing to look twice. He stopped at the hatch and crouched, tracing the bolt pattern with one finger, as if remembering an old handshake. "You found the ledger," he said simply. "How do you know?" Dana asked. She felt defensive for no good reason. This land had been hers long enough to be suspicious of anyone who treated it like a museum piece. Ellis smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Your grandfather and I used to buy and sell things when the world thought they were worthless. He kept notes. I kept contacts. We kept quiet." He turned to her, and there was a softness that surprised her. "He was a good man." Dana folded her arms. "Then you'll tell me where the rest of it went, right?" "Who took what?" Ellis's jaw tightened. "Not everything got taken. Not everything could be accounted for. That hatch? It was a safety deposit for items your grandfather didn't trust anyone else with." He tapped the ledger. "There are names here. Shipments that never cleared formal channels. There are people who would kill for half of what's on these pages." Ava stepped forward before Dana could stop her, eyes wide. "Kill? Like bad guys?" Ellis knelt, bringing himself closer to her level. "Like the kind who make other people feel small so they can feel big. But that's not what your grandfather wanted. He hid things so they'd belong to whoever cared enough to find them." There was a beat of silence that felt like a held breath. Dana had expected greed, paperwork, maybe even an offer that smelled like pity. Instead, she felt an odd mix of protection and warning. Ellis wasn't there to buy. He was there to remember. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because he asked me to," Ellis said. "Years ago, when the yard was just breaking even, your granddad pulled me aside and told me he had a plan. If anything ever happened to him, he wanted a person he trusted, someone with stubborn hands to get first look. He said, if she can find it, she'll know what to do." Dana's throat tightened. She closed her eyes and thought of the way her grandfather used to hum while he worked, the way his fingers smelled like grease and peppermint. He'd never said anything like that to her directly. Maybe he thought she wouldn't listen. Or maybe he'd known she would come when she had nowhere else left to go. Ellis stood and patted her shoulder once, quick and businesslike. "There's more," he said. "But there are also men who still look for what's hidden. You'll need help, and not just from Greaves and me. You'll need to be smart about who you trust." She didn't like the warning, but she preferred the truth to false comfort. "Then tell me what you know," she said. "No sugarcoating." Ellis nodded and opened his newspaper, folding it at a column he'd marked. He began to talk about names, about a shipping manifest scratched into the ledger, about a container that had been marked confidential and then disappeared from public record. He pointed to a date. "If that shipment ever arrives," he said quietly, "it'll change everything." Dana listened until the light faded and the shadows pulled long across the yard. When he left, he handed her a small, yellowed card with a name and a number scrawled on it. An engineer at a scrapbroker in the city. Someone who might remember serial numbers and rare alloys. That night, as Dana tucked Ava and Max into the same nest of blankets, she felt the weight of possibility settle again, heavier now. Yes, but particular, like a tool in the right hand. She kept the card in her pocket. The yard was quiet, but this time it sounded different. Not empty. Active, waiting. She had stumbled into more than metal. She'd found a story that had been paused mid-sentence, waiting for someone stubborn enough to finish it, and she was tired of leaving sentences unfinished. The next morning began with a list. Dana pinned names to the wall of the trailer office, a hand-scrawled map of people and places, each one a thread leading away from the yard. First was the engineer Ellis named, a man who worked with serial numbers and could read the language of stamped metal. Then a broker in the next county known for moving hard-to-sell parts. A local historian who knew Lockridge Plant's odd shipments. Dana felt, for the first time in weeks, a faint thread she could follow. But plans require shoes and gas and sometimes bribes for coffee. Money still crawled like ants in the bottom of her pocket. So she did the only thing she could. She started with what she had. She taught Ava and Max how to label things the way Granddad used, to simple tags, short notes, dates. If it was important, it'll have a mark, she told them. And if not, we still get to know what it used to be. They took to it like kids handed a treasure map. Max loved the rusted license plates, lining them up like cards. Ava found joy in brushing layers of dust off brass fittings, revealing numbers that told stories. With Martin Greaves' help, they pried the hatch, open that afternoon. It took muscle, a borrowed jack, and a lot of swearing. But when the lid slid aside and cool, stale air breathed out, the kids squealed, and Jasper darted forward, nose twitching over crates and shapes wrapped in tarps. The hatch led into a shallow vault, concrete walls lined with racks and crates. The smell was a mix of old grease, oil, and something metallic that made Dana dizzy with nerves. She shone her flashlight down one row and froze. There it was, a row of small, wooden crates stamped with manufacturer codes she recognized only from the ledger. Between them sat a cluster of cylindrical objects that looked innocuous until Greaves traced a finger over a faint stamping and hissed. "Aircraft. Grade magnesium alloy," he said. "Used in specialty builds. Respectable collectors would pay a fortune for a single casting." Dana moved through the vault carefully, pulling aside packing, reading tags. There were carburetor assemblies with serials that matched, the ledger, odd-shaped hydraulic lines for prototypes, a crate of corrosion-resistant bushings listed for defense contractors decades ago. Her heart hammered. This was not junk. This was curated salvage items collected with an intent she hadn't expected. They cataloged everything they could that first week, making lists, photographing items with a cheap phone, and sending Ellis's engineer contact pictures that got longer replies, and then a request to see the goods in person. The engineer, a woman named Leela, arrived 2 days later with a laptop, a scanner, and a look that said she'd been waiting her whole life for a find like this. "You've got serials here that could call a few serious buyers," Lila said as she worked, cross-referencing numbers. "Some of these parts didn't leave the right hands often. You're sitting on parts from limited runs, prototypes, specialty alloy castings. If you play this right, you don't just get by. You change the scale of everything." Dana swallowed hard. "Play it right how? Sell it? Restore it? Auction it?" Lila glanced up. "All of the above. But carefully. A public blunder could make people who'd prefer these parts stayed hidden come asking questions." They formed a plan that evening around a rusted table under a single dangling bulb. First, authenticate. Get a trusted appraisal from a third party. Second, restore select cash pieces to prove provenance. Third, approach specialized collectors and museums quietly. Fourth, set up an online auction for less sensitive items, but keep 1 or 2 headlines private to drive interest and protect the biggest pieces. The kids loved the idea of an auction. It sounded like a party. They helped by painting small placards and making lot numbers on cardboard. Dana laughed for the first time in weeks at Max's dramatic auctioneer voice and Ava's careful script reading. It felt almost normal. At night, after the kids slept, Dana scrolled through potential buyers and marketplaces, trying to imagine sending crates across the country. The ledger lay open beside her, each page a promise and a risk. She kept thinking about Ellis's warning, about men who would fight for what was hidden. But she also thought about the line her grandfather had scribbled once. "Value hides where people forget to look." They weren't hiding anymore. Not if she had anything to say about it. When Lila called the next morning with a list of verified items and a conservative estimate that made Dana's breath hitch, the numbers on paper felt unreal. She stared at them until the ink blurred, and then, slowly, a smile broke across her face. "Okay," she whispered to the empty trailer. "Let's make this ours." It wasn't long before trouble arrived. Not through the front gate, but through a letter thick, official, with a name Dana hadn't heard in years. Travis Merrow. Her ex-husband's former business partner. The same man who once mocked her for walking away with nothing but a junkyard and a dog. Now, he claimed partial ownership of the land and its contents, citing a deferred asset clause buried in old legal paperwork from their divorce. Dana's hands shook as she read the fine print. The vault, the auction, everything she'd unearthed, he wanted a piece of it. Ellis confirmed her worst fear. "He's not bluffing," he said, "but he's also not expecting you to fight." For the first time, Dana saw how fear could blur into fury. She wasn't just defending parts or property. She was protecting the only honest thing she'd rebuilt for her kids and herself. So, she called a lawyer. Found paperwork her grandfather had stashed in a wall safe behind the trailer. Receipts, transfer deeds, proof. She wasn't going to be bullied. Not this time. The courtroom smelled like polish and nerves. Dana sat straight, palms sweaty but eyes steady. Travis wore his usual smugness like a tie. His lawyer spoke first. confidently citing ownership rights and supposed investments Dana had never seen a dime of. But then her lawyer stood calm, quiet, and handed the judge the safe-stored documents, a notarized title, a personal letter from her grandfather naming Dana sole beneficiary, and photos of the ledger's contents dated well before Travis ever entered the picture. The judge's eyes narrowed. So this was never yours to claim. Travis paled. Outside, under the courthouse steps, Dana let herself cry. Not from fear, but from the weight finally lifting. The ruling was in her favor. She owned the yard fully, legally, and undeniably. By the time she returned home, Ava and Max had painted a sign. Holt Salvage. Now, Open Jasper wagged his tail like he understood everything. The chaos wasn't over. But the fear? That was behind her now. She'd stood her ground. And for once, she'd won. The morning of the auction, the yard didn't feel like a graveyard anymore. It buzzed. Literally and metaphorically. The sun caught on polished chrome, boxes were stacked in neat rows, and Ava had strung string lights between two shipping containers to make it feel official. Max wore a cardboard badge that read security, and Jasper trotted behind him, proud as ever. Dana stood in the old trailer, watching the viewer count tick up on the live stream screen. Hundreds, then thousands. Lila managed the bidding system, while Martin and Ellis handled item descriptions and live commentary. They'd photographed every part, confirmed provenance, and arranged shipping quotes. And now, it all came down to this. The first item, a 1,960 seconds aviation turbine blade with Department of Defense markings, opened at $400. It sold for $6,700. Dana's hands trembled. Next came a crate of cast aluminum fittings, then a rare prototype throttle linkage. Bidding wars broke out. Comments flooded the chat. Where was this stuff hiding? This is better than TV. Someone called the Smithsonian. A restored panel from a Cold War surveillance aircraft went for $18,000. Lila leaned over. Dana, we just cleared 6 figures. She couldn't speak. Her voice caught in her chest. Not from disbelief, but from validation. You wasted everything. Every laugh, every whisper about her being naive, or too soft or too hopeful, vanished like dust on the wind. As the auction neared its end, a final item remained. The one Dana had almost kept for herself, a mint-condition instrument panel with original wiring, restored to full display condition. Her grandfather had once told her it was from a project that never should have existed, but did. Ellis called it a ghost in perfect condition. The starting bid was $1,000. Within 5 minutes, it was at $24,000. By the end, it sold for $91,200. Silence followed the final hammer click, not just in the trailer, but across the live stream. Even the bidders seemed stunned. Dana wiped her eyes. She hadn't realized she'd been crying. Ava and Max burst into the trailer a moment later, holding a hand-painted sign. Mom's yard made $1 million. Technically, it hadn't, not yet. But the post-auction estimate, after processing and private offers still pending, would push them close. And for the first time, the number didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd done this. Not alone, never alone, but driven by the choice to believe something broken could be worth saving. The sky blushed with orange as Dana stepped outside, coffee steaming in her hand. The auction was over, the yard still humming with the buzz of what came next. Logistics, pickups, negotiations. But this moment, it was hers. Jasper padded up beside her, pressing against her knee. In the soft light of morning, the yard looked different. Still rusted in places, still wild around the edges but no longer forgotten. It had become something else. A monument to perseverance. Inside the trailer-turned office, the ledger now rested inside a glass case. Next to it was a framed photo of her grandfather, grease-stained and grinning, holding Ava as a toddler on one knee. Dana had found it tucked in the back of an old filing cabinet the day before. Like everything else he left her, it had waited patiently for the right time. Later that week, A restoration museum offered to sponsor a permanent collection featuring the Holt salvage find. Ellis offered to help curate. Lila offered to speak at the opening. And Dana, she simply agreed to show up. But she wasn't chasing headlines. Instead, she met with her lawyer to set up a college fund for Ava and Max, then used part of the proceeds to finally fix the roof and renovate the house. Each room became a project, a celebration. She let the kids choose paint colors. Ava picked sky blue for her bedroom. Max chose fire truck red for his. Dana reopened Holt Salvage as a functioning parts restoration hub, not just for profit, but as a place where other people could bring their broken things and learn how to make them whole again. She started hosting weekend workshops, small ones, free for single parents and veterans. She didn't advertise. Word spread anyway. One Saturday, she found Max sitting in the dirt beside a dented carburetor, trying to unscrew it with a butter knife. When she asked him what he was doing, he looked up and said, "Fixing the past." She couldn't have said it better herself. Months passed. Then a year. And on the anniversary of the auction, Dana stood by the now sealed hatch with her kids, holding hands and staring down at the faint outline in the earth. "Why didn't we dig it all up?" Ava asked. Dana smiled. "Because sometimes it's not about taking everything. Sometimes it's about knowing it's there and leaving some of it behind, for someone else to find when they need it." The sun rose higher, painting the yard in soft gold. They stayed like that for a while. Quiet. Together. Whole. She'd been called reckless, foolish, dreamy. But today, standing on land they said was worthless, beside the children they said would suffer, Dana knew the truth. She hadn't wasted everything. She'd built something from it. And no one would ever laugh at that again.